Good afternoon and welcome back to block 2 of our streaming today. We have coming up for you 3 lectures, starting off with, from what I'm understanding of the pre-chat, 2 folks sitting with dogs in their room. So Benny's just here to say hi to the dog people on the other end of this call. So we're starting off with a lecture with Mariano Aguirre on rhythmic articulation, hosted and moderated with Nemanja Ostojic, who's our supposed to be our host this year in Indianapolis. So thank you, Nemanja, for being here for part of this. Our second lecture, followed by Q&A that we'll go into, is with Mariette Stephenson about women's contributions in guitar orchestras. And then we'll finish out this block with a lecture by Jonathan Godfrey on writing for the classical guitar. All of those sessions will be followed by live Q&As, so hop in the Zoom rooms. If you're still not registered, go to the GFA website to get registered and get the passwords. Enjoy the block.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mariano Aguirre. I'm coming to you today from New York City in Manhattan. Thank you all for being here. Before we start, I want to thank the GFA for inviting me to present this lecture. Martha Masters, the president, and everyone at the GFA who has done an amazing job at transitioning the convention online. So I'm very thrilled to be able to present the lecture here today. The lecture that I'm going to be presenting is based on rhythmic organization and meter awareness. I designed this lecture thinking of how to incorporate into simple technical exercises that we all do, simple scales, scale patterns and arpeggios, and how to incorporate a bigger awareness of rhythmic articulation and rhythmic organization. The idea of this lecture came, I teach guitar, but I also teach a lot of music theory courses where I also teach rhythm. One of the things in my music theory courses that I've always noticed through years of teaching them is that some of the theoretical concepts there are not always applied to the guitar, to our instrument. And some of these rhythmic concepts come from rhythmic training in those theory classes, but also through experience of myself and through listening to students and colleagues practicing technique and noticing that in the common technical exercises that we do, we don't incorporate this rhythmic awareness and rhythmic articulation to the exercises that we do. I have some some slides to share with you, some screen share, which I will do right now. The first one I would share is the basis of this lecture, which came from hearing myself and hearing students and colleagues practicing scales in the practice room. Up and down and focusing on tone production, on speed, on clarity. But as we can see, one thing that struck me is in the method books that we get of scales, the scales are presented without any meter, without any time signature. So this example that we have here does not have really any rhythmic difference. Every beat can be understood as just the same impulse, the same impact, no difference of time signatures or meter awareness. The idea is instead of practicing the scale with no meter in mind, was to maybe incorporate from the very beginning always rhythmic articulation, and that way develop a bigger rhythmic awareness. I discovered this in scales like you see here from a old guitar book that I have from an Italian publisher. You see here on, that was Italian. Now you see also here in Spanish, English. This is from Sagrera's book #1. Also, no meter indication. So when practicing our scales, we tend to articulate everything the same with no rhythmic articulation. And besides the rhythmic awareness and the theoretical aspect behind it, I think that applying this method to technical exercises also helps us develop better right hand finger control, better control also of how our left hand fingerings affect our accents. We tend to accent notes that fit in the fingering in a certain way. Like for example, sometimes string crossings get accented, or the top notes of the scale get accented. A little bit randomly, and not really with an awareness of the rhythms that we want to perform. Then I thought, well, we practice a technique like this, but then when we go to our repertoire, we do not want to play without a rhythmic awareness. So that, this is something useful to apply during our technique practice, so that when we want to transfer it to our repertoire, we have that in our fingers. We have practiced that. We also are more aware of our left hand fingering and how it's affecting the accentuation on the different melodies, different parts of the music we play. Okay, next screen I want to share. It's just some concepts about rhythm. The first concept in rhythm is the most basic and fundamental is the pulse, right? Just a regular beat, a regular rhythm that we call it, which is just a thump, a strike. When we do it on an instrument, just a regular pulse that we all naturally have in our bodies, starting from our heart, the pulsations on our heart. And I think that if we're in tune with that part of our nature, we have the capability of playing on a regular beat. If we listen carefully. Now, when we just have a pulse with no rhythmic differences, everything is being played at the same volume. I have here an example of a rhythm exercise that does not have any time signature, any meter in front of it. And as you can see on the quarter notes on the bottom, all which represent the pulse, All the pulses are marked at the same level, so they are all the same level of accentuation. If we were to play this, we would go, and probably what would determine the way we would accent the music, it's just where do we have a long note would get an accent. Probably we will group these two together. Then we will have 3 beats, but then we will probably do an accent again here, group these two, and then have another accent for the whole note. Therefore, just letting the length of the notes, the kind of the points. I like the term punctus that comes from notation, of a point. Whenever we have a note, we have a point. We have an event to play, but with no different levels of accentuation, really determined by a time signature. This is a little bit the way, what made me think, the way we practice technique that is not really developing a sense of meter when we practice. This takes me to the second term here, meter, which is, I like this definition, rhythmic organization. You're organizing the different rhythms, the different pulses, which are what we call the beats. And the most fundamental organization of the beats is having a strong beat and a weak beat, which again relates to our heart and how our heart pumps and goes down, pumps down. You have a strong beat and a weak beat. A little bit of terminology of this based in music. I like this term ictus, which since it says here, it comes from Latin, which means a blow or a strike. And in music, it means a metrical accent. So what we know as the downbeat. I like this term because it makes very clear that, it's a blow, a strike. And we tend to think of, a strike or a blow as something with a downward motion, with a heavier hit than something that would go up, which is the basic concept of having strong beats and weak beats in music that we call, strong accented beats and unaccented beats. The metrical patterns are recurrent rhythmic organization. So these are our time signatures, patterns of strong and weak beats that are recurrent and that create what we have as measures, that we divide as measures. Those are our basic rhythmic organization, our basic metrical pattern. The foundation meters, these are terms, this is a term I came up with. I think that the foundation meters are meters that have one strong beat, one ictus. And in music, we have 2 of them, which is the doppel meter, which has a strong and a weak beat, so 2 beats, and the triple meter, strong, weak, weak, a strong ictus, a strong accent, and 2 weak beats. Then from those 2 foundation meters, here I wrote a list of combined meters that combine the double and triple combinations, where now you have 1 strong beat plus 1 or more medium strong beats, depending on the mix of 2 double or triple meters, how you're gonna have this pattern. Here, the quadruple meter, which is 4 beats. You have a strong, a weak, a medium strong, and a weak, which is represented here in the 2 plus 2. Then the different terminology for the meters, the quintuple meter, 5 beats, arranged either 3 plus 2 or 2 plus 3, sextuple, 3 plus 3, 2 plus 2 plus 2, and different arrangements of 7 beats. There's more arrangements, of course, that one can come up, including some just one accents on one repeated, but these are some basic ones that I wanted to point out. And at this moment also point out, of course, that we have this very important issue in rhythm, which is the syncopation, which is when the regular recurrence of metrical accents is contradicted. When we have a syncopation, we have a nictus, we have a strong beat, and a place where we would be expecting a weak beat. And this takes me here just to different meter notations, time signatures, which in theory books, they're divided as simple time, when the quarter note gets the pulse, time signatures like 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, all of this where the quarter note is getting the beat, one pulse. And compound time signatures where the 8th note is getting the pulse. The 8th note gets the pulse in these time signatures at a slow tempo. But also once we get into compound time, where we can divide the beat into 3 equal parts, sort of like a triplet, and we get the pulse instead on the dotted quarter, adding 3/8 notes. And the time signatures we get 3/8, 6/8, 9/8, 12/8, 15/8 can be seen as a triple meter here, 3/8, 6/8 can be seen as a sextuple time, but it can also be divided into 2 groups of 3 at a fast tempo, making it a double meter, just 2 beats divided into 3. Okay, this is a little bit the theoretical aspect, and now I want to get into the exercises that I hope everyone has their guitars with them, and you can play along as we go over this. And please, if you have questions, you can type them on the chat, and we will address them in a little while at the Q&A at the end. Because I would like to know what you feel of this, if you feel the same reactions that I have on right hand control, left hand control, and what things pop up when you start practicing simple things with a bigger meter organization. So just very simple exercise I like to do, that I do with my beginner students, but I also do with my advanced students, which is just playing on open strings, and really by leaving the left hand out of the game, being able to focus on the right hand. And start practicing different meters, counting the beats out loud, and really being aware of the different fingerings that we're using and which finger gets the strong beat. Here I wanted to make a little bigger in the fingerings, the finger that will get the strong beat. So when you play in duple meter with 2 fingers, the meter aligns with our right hand fingering. So if you start with the index, your index will always get the strong beat. Now I recommend practicing all of this, counting the beats, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And also I think it's useful to, if you want to develop a connection with your right hand, to say the finger that you're playing. Index, middle, index, middle, index, middle, index, middle, index, middle. And practicing the opposite with the same 2 fingers, but starting with the middle, middle, index, middle, index, middle, index, middle, index, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Now here, just to point out as we go through this method to hear the difference of plucking both notes the same to start to develop a sense of rhythm. Now, I've seen with my students that the moment they start playing with more of this sense of rhythm, they immediately start to sway around and feel a little more the rhythmic organization, right? The dance aspect of rhythm, so important in music, really suddenly kind of becomes more natural than if we're just bouncing each beat the same. Here I pointed out, the different two-finger patterns that you could use: middle ring, ring middle, index ring, ring index, and really be aware and see, most of us have feel more natural certain starting finger. Some people feel more natural starting with the I, some people with the M, so that you really start to develop an awareness of that, and you become aware of which might not be your most natural or favorite way to start, but that this will come up in the repertoire. So you need to be able to be aware and be able to accent with rhythmic articulation, regardless of the finger that you're starting with or the fingering that you're using. Now, things become a little more complex and interesting. Some beginner students and intermediate students even have a little bit of trouble when trying to do a duple time 2/4 with 3 fingers, where now what you get is you have the index, middle, ring, middle, index, middle, ring, middle, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and really developing a control on your right hand where the middle finger, which tends to be strong, really needs to learn to be down, and then practicing it with the reverse order, starting with the ring and counting 1, 2, 1, 2, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, developing a bigger sense of the meter. This way of articulation, I also like to point out to students that in some Baroque treatises on performance, they would refer to playing in 8 notes, especially, or playing group of 2 notes, and they would refer it as the good and bad note. So really having a good, bad, good, bad, good, bad, good, bad sense of the notes. This, of course, it's very general. Of course, sometimes the bad note, we're going to want to emphasize the bad note, but I think that it helps drive the concept through, especially with young students. They like that concept of good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. Now here I demonstrate the same exercise on open strings, but on triple meter. Now you have 1 strong beat, 1 ictus, and 2 weak beats. Now, if you're playing triple meter with 2 fingers, then your strong beat is gonna switch between the index and the middle. As I put the example here, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, index, middle, index, middle, index, middle, index, middle, index, middle, index, middle. And this type of right hand awareness, I've come to discover is very important. Right now, I'm just doing it on open strings, but a lot of times that might determine how we finger, our right hand, to do certain things. Sometimes we might have the flexibility to finger it differently, but sometimes if we don't and we need to play with two fingers, it's good to have this development, this control, fine control of accenting with the different fingers. And then here, examples with three fingers were now in the triple meter. The three finger pattern fits the meter. Index, middle, ring, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And the opposite, ring, middle, index, middle, index, 1, 2, 3. Good, bad, bad, good, bad, bad, good, bad, bad, good, bad, bad, good, bad, bad. Sometimes I also like to have students to develop this idea of meter awareness and playing towards the downbeat, to come up with sayings in the different rhythmical patterns. It goes there, 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 it goes there. Sometimes with phrasing, when we're working phrasing in a certain passage, to really feel that drive towards the downbeat, it goes there when you're playing in 3. So, things like that. Then I also find that just even counting the beats, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, involves you in that you need to breathe, you need to count. Suddenly your counting becomes more linked to the music, more rhythmical. You need to breathe at the end of phrases. A lot of things that I think are beneficial for interpretation. I only have these two up to the triple. These are the two foundating meters. 4/4, then we'll be putting, as I said, together two double times with a strong, medium strong double time at the end of the meter. 3/4. I have here examples of the rhythmic organization. What we just went through, 2/4, the downbeat, the upbeat. I find this this is from a rhythm book by Robert Starr, a very common rhythm book training used in a lot of colleges. And I find it very helpful just to read on open strings or to even apply scales to these rhythmic patterns. And for example, here in this example in 2/4, really start to apply the 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. What tends to happen a lot of time is this weak beat over here after the tight note, we tend to play it with an accent. Sometimes we might want to do that on purpose, but it is on the weak beat. So it is good training to start to see these weak beats. And as you can see here now, the pulse, this rhythm book marks the pulse differently, having the strong beat here on the first space of the staff and the weaker beat on the second space of the staff. It also shows you here the concept of downbeat, upbeat, the conductor symbols for the meters. Here is the 3/4. Again, where, for example, here, these two weak beats, if we're playing in 3/4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. A lot of times, if we're not careful, we will play an accent here. As I said, sometimes you might want to do that depending on what the music is calling for. But to really develop the awareness that these are two weak beats going into this strong beat. And then here, this note, which comes on a weak beat, which could be interpreted as a syncopation, but also to notice that it is on a weak beat, so not necessarily to accent it, but to have the strong ictus accent here. Then I have these files available if anybody wants them. I guess you could, I don't know if you could send your email or I'll make them available through the GFA. This is just to visualize the different meters, the different organizations, 6/4 as 3+3 or 2+2+2, 7/4. These are just introductory, and then exercises like this that I find very useful, of alternating in 7/4 between quadruple time, triple time, and then exercises with changing meter, where then you are constantly having to accent different moments and be aware of how you're counting and how you're articulating each of the beats. Okay, that is all on open strings. As I said, very simple. These concepts can be, what I like is that they can be taught even to beginners, to little kids, to beginner adults, just on the open string. With kids, I like to call that the walking on the string, and really getting used to always counting and always having a meter awareness from the get-go. Now, here are exercises now using the left hand, of course. One very common exercise that a lot of guitarists we do is this 4-finger where I have never really heard anyone, if we're not paying attention, our accent is going to always be determined by the string crossing. If we're playing with 3 fingers, then we will accent in 3, and so forth. 2. Now, I point out here the 1 finger. This is from an exercise on Scott Tennant's book, Pumping Nylon. He has it on his warm-up. And it's just with 1 finger going up and down all strings. On the book, Tennant does not put a meter on the exercise. It's just generic punctus. But I like to, even from the start of just 1 finger, apply different meters to it. So play this in triple meter. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. And to not stop until you're back to beat number 1 on the 6th string where you started. The strong beats keep moving around the strings as you do this, really forcing you to not rely on either, the natural thing that we do of accenting the top note and the bottom note only, but really having that control. Then, doing that all with 1 finger, finger 2, 3, 4, but then also using 2 fingers. And instead of accenting in double meter, apply different meters to it, like 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. And I find that a lot of students have trouble reaching the end or the beginning of the pattern and not making an accent, and kind of losing the count and losing the awareness of where the downbeat is. Then, 3 fingers, 4 fingers. I find it very interesting with the 4-finger patterns to apply different meters, like in 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And the downbeat, the ictus, the beat number 1, keeps shifting finger, happening 1, 2, 3, 4 in different fingers on the different strings. And I've seen it that it's not that easy to control. Again, showing that sometimes whatever is happening on our left hand in our fingering has an impact on the way we accent things, on the way we perform things. This is the simple 1, 2, 3, 4 exercises that a lot of us do as warm-up exercises. Of course, you can play different arrangement of fingers, different exercises that you come up with. But always, as I put here on the top, emphasize the meter. This same thing can be done with up and down on a single string. I like to do tetrachord. With a lot of students, I like to introduce the concept of a 4-note scale on the major mode and the minor mode. And applying, of course, different meters to it instead of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, which will fit the pattern. Try to apply different meters that do not fit the left-hand fingering pattern. And of course, also switching fingerings on the right hand to develop control, naming the fingers on the right hand as you play. Playing scales from tonic to the dominant with the same idea. 1-octave scales on one string. This, when we do these shifts, we tend to do accents sometimes after the shift, not really controlling the rhythmic articulation, but letting the left-hand shifts determine the accent that we do. By practicing it with counting and being aware of the meter, it really helps to develop also the legato and kind of thinking it and singing it with rhythmic control and not letting the left-hand shifts determine. And chromatics on one string with shifts of 3 or 4 fingers. Again, very useful and challenging if you do it with meters that do not align to your left hand. All of this, then you can do it with 1-octave scales instead of no accentation, to always think in a meter 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Here we finish on a 3. A lot of times, I always feel with practicing scales, this kind of feels odd. You're not feeling on the 1. Same thing if you do 2-octave. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And then sometimes I say, well, if you want to finish on 1, 2, 3, 1, at the bottom note or at the top note, so that if you want to fit the meter into certain notes that fits you. But very useful to just play up and down the scale and having the accents shifting to different notes of the scale that you play. I comment with students, they start making right-hand mistakes and get confused because they're paying attention to the meter and to the right hand, maybe the way they articulate. And also because the way you're used to hearing the scale, if you always practice it with the same accentuation, it almost feels like if you're playing a different scale when you're accenting different scale degrees based on different meters, 3 octaves. And then all of this, right now, I'm not gonna have time to go over arpeggios, but how to practice it with different arpeggio patterns of 3 fingers or 4 fingers, in arpeggios with 3 notes, 4 notes, 5, 6 notes, and always using a meter to accent within an arpeggio pattern. So we're used to kind of always sticking to an arpeggio pattern that fits the right hand fingering sometimes, and try to accent an arpeggio in 6, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, and think, well, if I accent it in 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, then it fits the hand naturally. But if I accent in 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, then we're having to accent in the middle of the right hand pattern. So things like this also develop very good right hand control and can help you in the repertoire when you might need to accent an inner voice or you want to play louder an inner voice in a chord. You develop that ability on your finger. Okay, well, this finishes what I had planned for today. I have some other rhythmic organizations that go into dividing the beats. Of course, you know, we didn't talk about, well, what happens with 8 notes. And it's a little bit the same concept as with just quarter notes, but where, you know, the second 8 note will be weaker than the first 8 note, but still being aware of where it's located within the meter. These 2 8 notes being weaker than the downbeat and really taking you, leading you towards the next downbeat. Different exercises, starting to deal with syncopation, very useful for reading. Also, one thing you can do if you want to play on different strings is play the top notes with an open string, treble string, and then play 2 different strings for the strong and the weak beat. If you want to develop control of thumb accompaniment, that it's also very good. Then the beat subdividing into 3 different beats, which brings us to the triplet and how it relates to the compound time. When you have a lot of recurring triplets, music is usually written then in compound time. How 2/4 with triplets relates to 6/8. And the same relation here, 3/4 to 9/8, and so forth. And some exercises written with 2/4 counting, and then the equivalent written in compound in 6/8. This is subdividing the beat into 3 parts, equal parts, where again, the concept is the first of the equal parts would be louder than the other 2. And the last group of exercises would be subdividing the beat into 4 equal parts. I find this practice stages with my rhythm classes, in my theory classes, we practice them a lot. They really develop a good visual readiness for identifying these different rhythmic patterns on the spot with syncopations, and then exercises on different meters on how to apply the concept of dividing the meter into 4. Okay, I will stop here and go see if there's some questions. Go to the Q&A. Welcome back, Nemanja.
Welcome to you, and welcome to everyone who's watching us all over the world. What a fantastic lecture. I would first like to thank you for being here with us today and sharing this extremely useful lessons on rhythmic organization and application to music and teaching various student levels. I have a question that I would like to start. I've come to realize that perhaps using the middle finger versus pointer finger for the stronger beats, like we've seen, grouping the notes, so not just playing a stream of impulses, if you want, but rather grouping them so you would have some kind of metric hierarchy organization. I found that using the middle finger gives me like a natural accent, even when I'm not trying to have one, because just the position, you know, in physiognomy, the position in the hand just kind of grants us that extra little bit of push on the note. How do you find that applicable to all these exercises that you have mentioned?
As I mentioned, part of the use that I find in this method is exactly kind of becoming aware of which fingers kind of suit you better, more naturally to your hand, to play, to lead, to play the ictus, to play the strong beats, which fits better, which patterns in different situations. But, I always mention to students and with colleagues, what's your finger to go to? And I found, almost like 50-50 where there's some people who say, no, I always start with the index. I am with you. I start with the middle finger. It's more natural to me to accent that way. But I played in a guitar trio with a colleague, and he was, he couldn't believe it. He was, I don't understand. The index, it's your pointer finger, it's the one who's leading. And it has never felt equally natural to me to start with that finger. Part of the use of the method is then to really be aware of that. And in instances, develop that starting with the index a little more for instances where you are going to have to accent with the index and start with there, have that control in your hand.
Wonderful. Yeah, I perfectly agree. We're all different, and I think that's what makes us, unique. Our interpretations are all combined of those small micro elements that, that show eventually. Mm-hmm. Before we move on to the next question, I will also like to remind everybody watching that they can actually participate and ask questions. They can either register at the guitarfoundation.org, or they can go to the Facebook page and follow the chat and then ask the questions there as well. So the next question for Mr. Aguirre comes from Daniel Salazar. And Danielle wants to know, for someone that wants to work on this topic that you presented today, are you just working at a certain tempo with metronome? And if so, does growing in speed matter?
Yes, of course, it is different going at a slow speed than going at a fast speed. And as I always say, you need to practice this. You need to develop your technique at slow tempos before you try, playing faster. You need to develop the control to make sure you can apply that at a fast speed. I do not, one thing that I've also that has worked for me is I realized that developing this concept of meter and being very aware of the pulse organization has also helped me have a more steady beat and control on how I play the length of all the beats. So I am not, I do not practice all the time with the metronome. I do like to use the metronome sometimes to help with subdivisions if things are going fast, or in case you have really long notes and you want to have a subdividing metronome kind of pointing you. It's hard to play even on long notes. But definitely always, start slow. And once you develop that control, then go faster. And the moment you go faster, you might find fingerings that you thought were comfortable at a slow speed. You might need to change it. And you might realize this is not going to work. I was feeling great, always accenting with my middle finger, my comfort finger, but I'm going to have to do something else because at a fast speed, I need to change the fingering.
Yeah, great point. Sometimes we resort to, like fast notes. Maybe we can do like a tremolo pattern that also works too. And then you have the thumb as the accented one. Right.
Good you bring this up. One thing that I didn't mark on the fingerings on my slides was the use of thumb. I encourage from the beginning to practice two-finger alternation, thumb index, thumb middle. That produces a very natural, strong, weak pattern that is very useful to develop this meter awareness. And I recommend practicing forcing the thumb to be in the weak beats, so that you train your thumb to not be a bully, and always play loud. Very, very useful for if you're having passages where you do PIM or arpeggios, where you don't necessarily want the thumb notes to stick out.
Excellent. We have the next question from Rodrigo Paiva. He's asking, what book did you use in the lecture when you were explaining rhythmic organization?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you clearly.
He was asking, Rodrigo Paiva was asking, what book have you used for the rhythmic organization during your lecture?
Oh, it's the book is called Rhythmic Training by Robert Starrer. It's a very common book here in the US in colleges for theory classes, rhythmic training. Robert Starrer, he was for many, many years a teacher at Juilliard. And this book, the examples are from this book, Rhythmic Training by Starrer.
Fantastic. And then we have one last question from our very own Chuck Houlihan from the GFA. He's saying hello and he's thanking you for the wonderful lecture. Chuck is asking you if you could address how to work in expressive aspects like dynamics, color, vibrato, etc., into the organization of rhythmic motives that you have covered so well.
Right. Once you kind of stick to very kind of strictly accenting the strong beats and keeping the weak beats soft, of course once you start applying it to repertoire, you're going to discover that you don't want to play loud on the next downbeat, right? You might not want to hit that note very loud, right? The phrase, you might want to play that softer, but you still need to be aware that this is the 1, 2, 3, 1, and there is the downbeat. Because what I find a lot of times after the shift, that has a big determining factor, and sometimes we play it quietly because we're afraid we're gonna miss that note. So the fingerings have an impact on how we play things. I always recommend separating the melodies and playing them, for example, here, just as a single voice. 1, 2, 3, 1. And then, as I said, I like to be creative and come up with little, nonsensical words if you want, but and it goes there. So you're very clear of where you want to lead your phrase. It goes there. We don't say, and it goes there, right? And it goes there. Even if you do a decrescendo for the downbeat there, you're still leading there. You're still going there. I have some students who are great at coming up with great little phrases. It's fun with kids. And it really forces you to engage, kind of like a singing, and engage your breathing into your playing, into what you're doing. When you're naming things, you're inventing lyrics to the melody. So that is very, very helpful to develop expressiveness.
Fantastic. Yeah, I agree. It's when the idiomatic and metric kind of clash, and you try. It's all about the context.
Correct.
Well, I think that's the last question that we had to answer. And with that, I would like to, first of all, thank Mr. Aguirre for this fantastic lecture today. Very useful. I know that I've learned a lot myself. And then I'd like to thank everyone for taking time to be with us and to enjoy this lecture too. And I invite you to be with us for the remainder of the evening. So with that, thank you very much. And thank you to Mr. Aguirre once again. And then we'll see you during the rest of the week here at the online GFA 2020.
Thank you so much, Nemanja, and thank you everyone at GFA. And yeah, please everyone keep following the live streams. This is very amazing. So thank you, and thanks so much for all the work on setting this up online.
Pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Bye, Nemanja.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
The sound I found very charming. Vibrato is very easy to make, and it
Yeah,
sounds
definitely.
actually very good.
I think Imperial was my favorite one because it has really good projection, but mostly it just suits my guitar best.
I fell in love with Regal strings, and I use them on my guitar. For live use, I think it's amazing.
Hello to all my GFA friends and guitar family. A special shout out to my Woodring family if you're watching. It is an honor to be a part of this year's online GFA festival, and I hope you're enjoying it. I want to welcome you guys to the Woodring Guitar Shop that we built 2 years ago. It's brand new, and I've been really enjoying building guitars in here. We also get to host concerts and master classes, and I can't wait to resume doing that once we start getting to more normalcy in life again. As you can see, I've been pretty busy building commissions, which is pretty awesome to have right now. And hopefully start some new ones in this fall. If you have any questions or want more information about my guitars, please visit my website at woodringguitars.com. And in the meantime, I want you guys to just stay healthy and safe, and I hope to see many of you soon. And I look forward to the 2021 GFA in Fullerton, California. Take care, everyone.
Like most guitar makers, I work alone. That's why convention like GFA are important to me. I always look forward to get together with all friends. Visiting city, seeing concerts. It was the highlight of the year. Not this year. We all know why. Instead, I found beauty in my immediate surroundings. I started experimenting guitar making almost 40 years ago. I quickly narrowed it down to classical guitars. I loved the richness of its tone, its repertoire, and mostly the people. After years of listening to classical guitar, I developed a strong opinion on how my guitar should sound like. I make every effort necessary to achieve that sound. The sound I want comes through both design and wood, especially the soundboard. Whenever possible, I travel to the supplier warehouse to hand select the wood of these tops. I measure density on site. Once at the shop, I measure stiffness, damping, and keep a database. This database allows me to evaluate the quality of my wood and also brush aside many myths about both wood species and guitar making in general. I measure constantly what I built. This allows me to better understand and hear the effects of the choices I've made. Obviously, guitar making is still art. I'll still rely on intuition, experience, skills, know-how, and attention to details. Combining art with data helps me reach my goals reliably. I do have a waiting list, and the people waiting my guitars expect something consistent with what they have seen from me in the past. So this makes the GFA all the more important. It gives me the opportunity to try new ideas, show my progress as a guitar maker. Because almost after 40 years, I am still learning, and that's what I like about my job. I will not be there in 2021, but hopefully I'll see you in 2022.
I'm Lung Yong from Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm an engineer, and I own an engineering company that primarily works for the U.S. federal government throughout the U.S. and occasionally overseas. I play guitar as a hobby, and it served me well as a means for musical expression. And I happen to be on the board of trustees. This is my first year in that position. And one of the reasons I guess I decided to be on the board was the fact that I felt it has a lot of very talented, passionate people who are really into the classical guitar world. And I was very excited to be part of that, and I hope I can make a contribution as I go along. I've been to 2 GFAs in 2018 and 2019, and they were a lot of fun. I met a lot of classical guitar enthusiasts, listened to a lot of great performances by top-notch performers, sat in on some master classes, and watched a lot of students play at a very high level. The vendor show was excellent. Met a lot of luthiers, string vendors, accessory salespeople, and all sorts of fun characters who are really into classical guitar like me. And I also, I guess, was able to increase my knowledge of the classical guitar world just by talking to people I met. And people very generous with their time and very happy to share information, and a lot of good camaraderie, I would say. With the virtual convention this year, the GFA is using this opportunity to open our convention and conference up to people around the world who might otherwise not be able to attend in person. And hopefully, I guess we might be able to get a few more new fans and people interested in participating in GFA. And at this point, I would like to also ask our viewers to make a donation to the GFA or become a member of the GFA and support our organization. You can give directly to the GFA through our website or through the PayPal link that will appear on the screen after this video. Well, thank you for watching. Stay well and stay safe.
Welcome. I'd like to thank the Guitar Foundation of America and all of you for attending my presentation. I am a guitar teacher and performer, and I am currently the music director for the Kitchener-Waterloo Guitar Orchestra. The development of guitar orchestras as an alternative to other music ensembles in community music and music education is not new. Guitar orchestras were at their height of popularity in the late 1800s and early 1900s in both Europe and North America, playing an unheralded role in the promotion of the suffragette movement, and they have seen a strong resurgence within the past 20 years. Thanks in part to the development of the Austin Classical Guitar Society's curriculum that uses an ensemble format to teach guitar, guitar orchestras are increasing in popularity in schools, community groups, and outreach programs. They offer a wonderful alternative to traditional orchestras and choirs, and increasingly they are used by community outreach groups to teach members social skills, team building, as well as positive behavioral outlets via creative endeavors such as music. In this presentation, I will discuss the history of European and North American guitar orchestras and their support of women in music, which continues today. The guitar has been played as a solo instrument and in various ensemble formats for hundreds of years. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, it exploded in popularity in Europe. France and Italy were the main centers for this guitar craze. There were highly respected performers, composers writing for the instrument. Publishers were churning out guitar music to meet public demand as a solo instrument, accompaniment for other instruments, and guitar ensembles. Prior to this, Baroque guitar and its relatives, such as the lute and viola, were featured as both solo and ensemble instruments. We know that women often played in these ensembles, for example, the Concerto delle Donne, established in 1588 by the female composer and lutenist Leonora Orsini, and that music education was part of a respectable young lady's tutelage before marriage. Not only did women perform in these groups, but they composed for them as well. The most renowned from this time, whose music is still in existence today, include Francesca Caccini, Barbara Strozzi, Leonora Orsini, Maddalena Casulana, all from Italy, Mademoiselle Bouquet in France, and Leonora Duarte in Portugal. As society evolved in Europe over the next 200 years, we see that music education continued to play a role in the training and development of young ladies who would be marriageable and accepted into society. As musical instruments developed, the guitar was still seen as a suitable instrument for a refined young lady to learn. However, despite receiving an extensive music education, at this time it was still not deemed as seemly for a woman to be a professional, that is paid, performing musician or composer. There were very few respectable opportunities for women to perform publicly in an ensemble until the arrival of the new fashionable trend of guitar and guitar mandolin orchestras. The first popular large ensemble format featuring guitar was established in the late 1800s, and the pairing of guitar and mandolins began at the same time. It was in these types of ensembles that women were first allowed, particularly in England, to play in public. The rise in popularity of guitar orchestras that included female members parallels the development of the suffragette movement in Europe and North America, but it could not have happened without the efforts and influence of two key women, Queen Margherita of Italy and the renowned London-based guitar teacher, Madame Sidney Pratten. The Italian Queen Margherita of Savoy was born to Prince Ferdinand, Duke of Genoa, and Princess Elizabeth of Saxony. She received an education that was more advanced than most princesses would receive at that time, and was said to have a good deal of intellectual curiosity. She married her first cousin, Umberto, Prince of Piedmont, in 1868, and became an important figure in the promotion of Italian culture. Her private salon was one of the most exclusive and famous in Europe. She was an expert mandolin player and was patron for the first formally organized guitar mandolin orchestra in Italy in 1881. Eventually, the rage spread to other countries, including England and the US. In England, Victorian social morals did not allow respectable women to join standard orchestras, although women at this time were performing in a few orchestras elsewhere in Europe. And it would continue until 1913, when female violinists were finally allowed to play alongside men in the Queen's Hall Orchestra. Until then, women were only permitted to play in female guitar mandolin bands in fundraisers for charities. Mandolins and guitars were seen as suitable for women to play. The instruments are small, nicely shaped, and played when seated. Instruments like the violin, cello, oboe, and the entire brass family were deemed unsuitable for a respectable woman to play due to the necessary contortions. During this time, there were many women who trained to a professional standard of musicianship, starting in 1876 with the opening of the National Training School for Music in London, England. By 1885, London and other large cities had many musically talented young women with few outlets for their abilities, other than playing at home, becoming governesses, or the poorly paid profession of the private music teacher. The guitar and mandolin were not taught in British music schools at this time. However, the virtuoso guitarist and teacher, Madame Sidney Pratham, was now based in London and would be pivotal in assisting and promoting ladies' guitar ensembles, as well as instructing and developing its members. She was born Katharina Josepha Peltzer in Mulheim, Germany, and her father was the German guitarist and teacher Ferdinand Peltzer. Katharina was one of 7 children. Both she and her sister Julia were taught by their father. Peltzer moved his family to England in 1829 and was co-editor with Felix Turetsky and Leonard Schultz of the Julinead, an early guitar journal that promoted the music of Mauro Giuliani. At a young age, Katharina was already a prodigy, and prior to the move to England, Peltzer toured Europe performing duets with her sister Julia. She performed Giuliani's 3rd guitar concerto professionally before the age of 10. The family became friends with Giulio Rogondi, and Katharina was friends with him until his death, often performing with him in concert. Like Rogondi, she would also learn and perform on the concertina. By the age of 20, she was London's most important guitar teacher, and her students included Queen Victoria's daughter Louise, Princess of Wales. Many of her compositions were dedicated to women of London society and were for amateur players, although she would compose virtuosic pieces that demand considerable technique. In 1854, Katharina married the flautist Robert Sidney Pratham, and by all accounts, it was a happy marriage and lasted until her husband's death in 1868. She did not perform in public for 3 years following his passing, but eventually she resumed her performing and continued to teach, establishing a guitar school on Southampton Street in Bloomsbury Square with her sister Julia. Among her many accomplishments, she wrote 3 guitar method books. She is considered to be the first guitarist to have her own signature model made by a major manufacturer, and in his book Reminiscings of Madame Sidney Pratham, Frank Harrison credits her with teaching upwards of 2,000 pupils in her lifetime. In 1895, Pratham passed away and was buried in Brompton Cemetery, London, her grave paid for by students and friends. The example of Queen Margherita strengthened guitar's appeal for fashion-conscious ladies, especially when played in ensembles. Performing for pay was not deemed a respectable occupation for a British lady, but raising funds for worthy causes and benefit concerts was a commendable and Christian endeavor, and would not compromise a woman's status as amateur, that is, someone who developed their talent solely for the love of it, unsullied by financial considerations. This created the perfect environment for ladies' guitar and mandolin orchestras. The first guitar ensemble, which was called Ladies' Guitar Band, and happened to include mandolins, gave its first performances in England in March of 1886. The program included Italian songs and was a fundraiser for an industrial home for young girls of Westminster. It was formed by Lady Mary Hervey and her sister Miss Augusta Hervey, and all members were from wealthy aristocratic families. All members were students of the celebrated guitarist Madame Sidney Pratten, who had composed and arranged many pieces for this band, mostly for guitars only. From 1888 on, they were known as the Ladies' Guitar and Mandolin Band, engaged conductors to lead them, and were performing at charitable events in the most fashionable parts of London. In Britain, hundreds of these ladies' bands were formed. The quality of musicianship varied, and some were of a very high standard. Notables include the Clifton Ladies Band in Bristol, led by Mabel Downing, who had studied guitar with Madame Sidney Pratten, and Clara Ross's band, based in London. Some were established by members of the aristocracy, ladies' arts clubs, and music teachers. All performed at fundraisers for different causes, including the Temperance League, hospitals, Society of Women Journalists, and the Girls' Friendly Society. Most composers performed by the ladies' bands are male, but the exceptions were Madame Sidney Pratten and Clara Ross. Clara Ross composed most of her band's repertoire and became one of Britain's most recognized composers at the time. She also wrote for voice and piano, writing over 70 published works. Born in 1858, her family were wealthy shopkeepers in Brighton. As a child, she received music studies and won the Bristol Scholarship to attend the National Training School for Music. Her main instrument was piano, completing her training there in 1882. She stayed in Kensington, composing songs with piano accompaniment. After 1885, when mandolin was becoming popular, she mastered the instrument and became a teacher, performer, and composer for it. She eventually started the all-female Kensington Mandolinists in the early 1890s. She composed most of their repertoire and led them, training members to a high musical standard, as mentioned in a concert review at Queensgate Hall on December 14, 1892. This group was eventually renamed Miss Clara Ross's Ladies' Mandolin and Guitar Band, rehearsing bi-weekly and performing Clara's music at numerous fashionable events in the City of London. Starting in 1890, her music was published by Phillips and Page, George White, and in 1894 had an exclusive agreement with London's leading publisher for plucked instruments, John Alvey Turner. Turner published 41 of her works for mandolin over 10 years, and her compositions were highly regarded. The parts the band used have not survived, but Turner would publish mandolin music in two versions, mandolin with piano accompaniment and mandolin with guitar accompaniment. By now, Ross was in her late 30s and was extremely well respected in London, but she decided to move to the US in 1885 and marry Richard Atkins Griffin, an Irish operatic tenor she had met as a student and who had moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He had a successful career as a singer and teacher under the name Riccardo Ricci. They settled in Wheeling, West Virginia, and Ross, now Clara Ross Ricci, devoted herself exclusively to teaching voice and only composed songs for women's voices and piano. Her music was still published in England until the early 1900s. After her husband's death in 1905, Ross stayed in the US, but returned to Brighton after World War I and lived there until her death in 1954. The Bristol area had a long history of music making, and the guitar remained very popular there well after the guitar craze had died down in other places. There were many ladies' bands locally, but according to Paul Sparks, one woman and one ensemble stood out for the quality of their repertoire and concerts. Mabel Downing was born in March of 1870 in Weston-super-Mare. She had an older brother, John Edward, and her father, John Henry, was married to Kate Downing and was a prosperous auctioneer. She appears to have excelled at music studies, notably on the harp. She also studied guitar with Katharina Pratten and mandolin with Leopoldo Francia, a virtuoso from Milan. By 1895, she was advertising in the local paper, offering music lessons on the harp, guitar, mandolin, zither, and philomel. She had also started and led the Clifton Ladies Band, a group of 18 amateurs who devoted their services to charitable endeavors. Their early repertoire was mostly light Italian works, but within a few years they were playing works including Symphony No. 1 by Berthold Tors and Waltz No. 1 by Samuel Coleridge Taylor. They performed regularly, including annual concerts. She conducted many ladies' bands in the area, and in 1895 created for the best players the West of England Ladies' Guitar and Mandolin Society. The society was made of the Clifton, Bath, and Weston-super-Mare ladies' bands, plus some outside members, and held general meetings at the Imperial Hotel every 6 weeks. The three bands practiced separately under Downing and had about 50 members. A local paper stated that it believed it was the largest society of its kind in England, and only performed for charitable purposes, for which they were in great demand. One of the mandates for Downing with this ensemble was to raise the status of the mandolin and kindred instruments. Based on my research, Downing never married. Her parents died within 2 days of each other in 1897, and her father's funeral was announced in the local paper. Her brother John Edward had married a woman by the name of Ella Buston, but he died at the age of 30 in the spring of 1899. After her parents' deaths, Mabel lived with her grandmother, Mary Jane Downing, and according to the census, they had boarders living with them until her grandmother's death at the age of 83 in the winter of 1903. Her sister-in-law was sadly institutionalized a few years after Mabel's brother's passing. In 1909, Mabel was asked to be part of a delegation of City of Bristol representatives to travel to Canada to improve ties with various cities, including Winnipeg, the capital of the province of Manitoba. While on this trip, she performed numerous times. Many people from Bristol had emigrated to Canada, and the delegation visited places where there was a society of Bristol expats. It appears that on this trip, Mabel decided to move to Winnipeg. With so many of her family now passed away, she may have been looking for a new beginning. As well, it would only be a few years later that women would get the vote in Manitoba, which was years before England. This may have been another factor. She took out ads in the Winnipeg Free Press announcing that she would be accepting students, and according to a ship manifest list in 1911, she emigrated to Winnipeg at the age of 38. According to Free Press ads she placed in the next few years, Mabel taught harp, guitar, mandolin, and later ukulele. She occasionally gave concerts on the harp. Eaton's Store would include promos in their ads when she performed there, and even performed at a benefit with Nellie McClung giving a reading. Nellie McClung was a famous Canadian suffragette who was instrumental in women getting the vote in the province of Manitoba. The fact that she knew Nellie McClung leads me to wonder further that Mabel moved to Winnipeg because of the strong suffragette movement in the city. It was in 1916 that women would get the vote in Manitoba. Mabel wrote an article for the Free Press about the benefits of music education and appears to occasionally accompany singers in concert, but she emigrated back to England after World War I in 1921. It is unknown why she went back, but by that point, women now had the vote in England. Census records show she did not return to Bristol but stayed in London. It is believed she passed away in the spring of 1950 at the age of 80 in a hospital in Chelsea from suspected food poisoning, where she had been a resident for 4 years. This is the only picture of Mabel Downing that is known to exist, and it was emailed to me from the Manitoba Legislature Library. British society in the late 1890s became more open to mixed-gender ensembles, although most were still women only. The largest at this time was the Polytechnic Mandolin and Guitar Band, who performed over 200 times in London and continued to perform up until World War II. Guitarists were also active in 19th century USA. Guitars were played both publicly by professionals, including soloists and accompanists, and privately by amateurs in private home entertainments. It was taught and studied in the US as it was in Europe. American teachers promoted their European background and that their instruction was based on pedagogy imported from Europe. The guitar was embraced by the aspiring American middle class, played by both men and women, both white and freed African Americans, by those who could not afford a piano, or by pioneers not yet settled enough to make a piano practical. The guitar's popularity waned from 1850 to 1880 in the US due to a growing interest in the banjo. Guitar concerts in the early 1800s were performed in parlors and featured popular music of the day. The banjo grew out of its use in the theater, particularly minstrel shows. Public music that featured the banjo was criticized by some as inappropriate for the refined entertainments of the middle-class family. By 1850, the technical abilities of banjo players had improved so much that professional banjoists had public competitions with cash prizes. These events inspired amateurs to learn the instrument, with guitar becoming less popular. However, it would not develop the same cultural cachet that the guitar had. In order to cultivate more respectability, banjo manufacturers and players began to pair their instrument with guitar and later the mandolin, creating the banjo, mandolin, and guitar, or BMG movement. Manufacturers and music publishers aggressively promoted these musical combinations via inexpensive magazines and devised new instruments and ensembles to enable performance opportunities for the BMG movement. These magazines show a strong community of manufacturers, publishers, performers, students, and teachers, and these instruments were played by both men and women. They believed their ensembles deserved the same respect as symphony orchestras. Many women were highly regarded as teachers and performers at this time, including Meta Bischoff Henning from Chicago, Elsie Tooker in San Francisco, and Jenny Durkee in Chicago and Denver. The most famous guitar soloists and guitar authorities, William Foden and Vada Alcott Bickford, maintain high profiles in these magazines, each writing columns for Cadenza and Crescendo, which promoted and reviewed their concerts and publications. As demonstrated by these photos, there were BMG and guitar-only ensembles that were male, female, and mixed-gender orchestras. Through her work promoting guitar, Vada Alcott Bickford would also help establish and become one of the first female music directors for a mixed-gender guitar orchestra in the US. Originally named Ethel Lucretia Alcott, she was born in Norwalk, Ohio in 1885. At age 3, her family moved to Los Angeles, and she began taking lessons when she was 8 with George Lindsay. In her late teens, she took lessons with Manuel Ferrer. In 1914, she moved to New York, where she taught and performed and assisted Philip J. Bone with his book, The Guitar and Mandolin. She married Myron Bickford, a mandolinist, in 1915. They were both astrology enthusiasts, and Ethel, soon after marrying, changed her first name to Vada. They returned to Los Angeles in 1923, and along with other local guitarists, started the American Guitar Society, then known as the Los Angeles Guitar Society. This photo shows her holding a baton, marking her as the music director of this orchestra. It's interesting to note that this was a mixed-gender ensemble, which could possibly make her the first female music director of a mixed-gender guitar orchestra in U.S. guitar history. She continued to write for the Crescendo magazine, teach, and established with her husband the Zarva Publishing Company. Vada remained active in the guitar community until her death in 1980 in Los Angeles. The BMG movement never attained the same respect with standard orchestras in the US. In 1928, Andre Segovia made his US debut, and the BMG movement wanted him to align himself with their cause, but Segovia distanced himself, saying that he was only interested in Spanish guitar. Segovia didn't approve of the aims of the BMG movement, which reinforced the stance of some already alienated classical guitarists within the BMG community, and they further distanced themselves. This led to the separation of guitar from the BMG community and the fading of BMG orchestras. I want to go back briefly to Mabel Downing's time in Winnipeg. I've often wondered why a successful guitar orchestra leader didn't start a guitar orchestra there. By the late 1890s, BMG ensembles were popular in most Canadian cities. The BMG movement appears to have reached Winnipeg prior to her move there, and there were at least 2 music schools in Winnipeg besides her own that had advertisements in the Winnipeg Free Press advertising guitar, banjo, and ukulele lessons. Also, there is a large Ukrainian community in Winnipeg, and in 1921, the Ukrainian Girls Mandolin Orchestra was started and continues to this day as the Winnipeg Mandolin Orchestra. Perhaps being a new arrival was a hindrance. I think there would have been the same number of doors closed to her based on her gender in Winnipeg as there was in England, but she was able to overcome those back home. Or perhaps she was burnt out from all the work involved with running the many ladies' bands in England. It saddens me that perhaps we'll never know why such an important and talented figure didn't make the same mark in her new city like she did at home. At the turn of the 1900s, the changes eventually brought by the suffragette movement allowed women to perform in public, perform on other instruments, and perform in mixed-gender ensembles. Unfortunately, this freedom to play other instruments in public and the market for cheaper orchestral instruments made it easier for middle-class ladies to learn these instruments, leading to competition and dwindling interest in female guitar orchestras. One area where classical guitar orchestras did thrive was in university music faculties, where classical guitar was offered as a field of study. Many faculties and conservatories since the 1950s have had guitar orchestras as mandatory ensembles for guitar students, which continues today. So what's happening in the 21st century regarding women's involvement in guitar orchestras? Dr. Cami Rowan is an internationally renowned American guitar pedagogue and is music department chair, guitar orchestra music director, and director of guitar studies at Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina. She established the U.S. Guitar Orchestra in 2019 with funding from the Aaron Shearer Foundation, where in their first season they performed the world premiere of 3 new compositions at Carnegie Hall and did a concert tour of France. Dr. Rowan sat down for an interview where we discussed her thoughts and experiences as a guitar orchestra music director and how she came to establish the U.S. Guitar Orchestra. Here's an excerpt.
So for me, hands down, it's community, 2 things: creating community and teaching guitarists how to play well with others. So, I mean, violinists, obviously, you thought of all these things. Violinists have to play in groups from an early age, but guitar culture is one of isolation frequently. Unfortunately, because the concept of guitar orchestra is so new, I feel like it's a very weak and flawed musical format right now due to cultural norms. So here are some problems I see. Like, 1, when we do play with others, we don't know how to listen. We're very egocentric and solo-focused as players, so this lends to the problem. But when I say we don't know how to listen, we literally don't know how to hear if we're playing with the person beside of us, right? 2, we don't have great conductors. Most guitarists aren't trained in conducting, and as we know from good string orchestras, conducting is a skill set, specific skill set. So an orchestra without a strong conductor isn't going to be a great orchestra. So there's that issue. There's the issue that we constantly fight our instruments' weaknesses. So, for example, guitarists have trouble playing a real pianissimo in an orchestral setting because we're always playing loudly to try to overcome our lack of volume as a guitarist. It's also difficult to place 8 or 10 pluck notes together at the same time. Our instrument doesn't lend well to an orchestral setting because of its build and its make. So I think those are just some examples of like why right now we say we do orchestra, but we don't do it at a really high level or very well yet. And I don't think it's like for you, like, sure, if we have local amateurs and people that just love guitar, of course we're doing this because we want to be collaborative and build community and bring community together. But it doesn't even matter what level the guitar player is. It's still a guitar player. And we don't know how to be a musician. We know how to be guitarists. And because guitar is so damn hard to play, we spend so much time trying to play the guitar that we frequently can't get beyond the fact that we're guitarists. You know, I kept on saying that on this tour was like, you can't be a guitarist. You know, you have to be a musician. You have to hear a phrase. You can't accent the first note of a slur. That's a guitar thing to do, but it's not a musical thing to do.
Yeah.
And then there's that, and the second part of that question is community. I'm collaborative. I'm nurturing in my nature. So I crave bringing communities and people together, and so it's where I find the most joy. So orchestras are an extension of that desire for me. You know, nothing brings a guitar community together more than a chance to share in a musical experience. I tried it out on a small level with Iceland with locals in June 2018. Because it worked so well, I saw how eager they were to travel. I was like, okay, guitarists want to do this. So I got an alum. His name is Ethel, and he got his undergrad with me and then went to Louisville with Stephen Mattingly and got his master's and came back. And he's working full-time for a nonprofit organization here. And I think the best thing a teacher can do is grow up their alums to work alongside of them or be better than me. So I just went to him and said, Ethan, I want to do this. Do you want to do it with me? And I had brought him on board. We were both on the board of the Aaron Shear Foundation. I needed a nonprofit to back me because I needed money to do it. So I pitched it to the Aaron Shear Foundation, and they were like, heck yeah. And we were we're going to have the 100th centennial. Shear would have turned 100 years old. So we were going to also have a celebration in Carnegie. So we were like, why don't we just combine the Carnegie Hall, centennial celebration with the USGO? So they gave me some money, and I needed that nonprofit as a support. And so we held auditions online, and we chose 41 players, which was more than I really wanted. I don't like the idea of exclusivity, so I took as many as I could. I was honored and humbled to be able to do it. It was not about me, it was about them, and it was about the group. And I was so nervous, and as soon as I just let that go and said, Kimmy, this is not about you, this is about them. And as soon as I put my focus there, I wasn't really that nervous anymore. And I just thought, you're just so lucky to have this experience. And I tried to just drink it in and just be there and be present and fully engaged. And I think they did too. And it was a really good experience. And like I say, I learned so much. We have to reckon, we have that issue, right? Solo, that, orchestra ensemble takes away from solo. I don't think my kids have that because I push them hard and challenge them in ensemble, and I think it's prevalent. It's prevalent in the U.S. That people wouldn't want to waste time with ensemble, So we have that challenge. But I think I like the idea that guitar orchestra can, if done correctly, raise the level of musicianship among guitarists. My colleague, Dr. Whitney Walker, she has her DMA from Indiana University, which is one of the big music schools in the U.S., and she has her DMA in choral conducting. And she knows her craft in her bones. I don't consider myself an expert conductor. It's something I've had to learn how to do through the years. And so Wendy Looker she's amazing. She's an amazing choral conductor and well known in the state of North Carolina. And what she does very well. I personally made a decision, probably based on a lot of Wendy, that a stick in my hand I cannot show the dynamic range, I cannot show the expression and the movement and the flow that I want to show with the group. And so I chose the choral conducting route, which is ironic because I'm doing instrumental orchestra, but I feel like in order to really show what I want to show, I more consider myself a choral conducting style. So that's an example of how I might have been influenced. And she never said that to me, but I just know with a stick, I'm limited, and for me personally, it's very disconnected from what I want them to feel and how I want them to move. So that's kind of an example of how she might have affected me, or how little decision I've had to make along the way, One of my big realizations is that in public schools in the U.S., and especially in younger orchestras and colleges, this quartet or septet or octet will come out, right, of guitarists, and then comes a conductor. I'm like, oh, hell no. You got to remove you're the guy and you're the mentor and the teacher, but if you never take yourself away and teach your guitarists how to look at each other, cue each other, non-verbally connect, look up from their music, right? Like, sure, if you have an orchestra, you can't really do that. Okay, if you have an ensemble, even up to 8, I'll go up to 8 with my college ensemble. It's like, no, you guys, these are your built-in cues. This is who's cueing. This is where you're looking here. I try to get them to look over their guitars, over their stands, look at each other, cue, breathe together, all the things that string orchestra people grew up knowing. But if you remove the conductor from a small group, you can train guitarists from an early age to communicate like a string quartet, right? And then when they get into the orchestra later, then you have a set of musicians who have that, who are in culture to do these things. Yeah. So that's something I've been doing, is removing myself as conductor. Sure, I'm up there practicing, guiding them, beating and teaching and all that. But when it comes down to the playing, I remove myself. Okay, now you guys, you do this, you listen, you play together as a group of musicians. And that's helping my kids become better musicians.
Currently, with its increasing popularity internationally, there are more female composers writing music for large guitar ensembles, including Olga Amokina-Vera, Nadia Borislava, Véronique Genet, Irina Kircher, Nathalie Lachance, Louisa Mathieu, and Annette Krausbrink. Annette Krausbrink is a Dutch composer born in Amsterdam. She studied the guitar with Peter van der Stok at the Conservatory of Zwolle and composition with Alex Manassen. She has composed over 300 works, including many for guitar orchestra, has taught and performed throughout Europe and South America. From 2000 to 2010, she taught contemporary music and ethnomusic at the Conservatory of Music in Zwolle. She is the producer of 20 CDs featuring her compositions and has won numerous prizes for her works. We recorded an interview that touched on composing for guitar orchestras and what it is like currently for women composers. Here's an excerpt.
Ways. If it's a commission, then very often you stick to a theme because it's a commission for a special event, and then it's easy. Then I immediately have the inspiration because the theme is already there. And sometimes when I write for children, I try to find a subject which attracts children. So, for example, I wrote an ensemble piece called Playground Suite, and it's meant for little children. And of course, I don't write another piece with a very heavy subject for children. It's out of the question. So it's logical choices I make, and sometimes I have a word, a strange word that I think, what a funny word. This is my new title. And then I start writing on the word. Or I play the guitar and I make a mistake. Oh, wow, what a nice mistake. It's the beginning of my new composition. For this quartet I played in, it was called the Zwolle Guitar Quartet. And because my hometown is Zwolle. And I wrote a piece for this quartet. My first piece for them was the Chippewa Nail Dance. I don't know if you know this piece, but it's a piece with all funny effects in it. And, well, it's, I think, recorded a lot of time. I've posted on YouTube. So if you are interested to listen at this piece, the Chippewa Nail Dance, it was my first ensemble piece. And also, very important, my first published piece. So I was very proud. Wow, my first piece being published. No, I don't think so. Sometimes I integrate it into one piece. Like I said, the second part is the easy one. The first part can be difficult, not necessarily when it's only for beginners. And sometimes I separate them, very easy piece all over. And when the ensemble, a professional ensemble, asks me to write for them, then of course I write for their level of playing. And it's not a problem for me to change from different levels. Or what I like most is to write personal. If someone asks me to write, doesn't matter if it's a guitarist or another instrument, I like to know the person in person, and then I can write a really personal piece. It was a radio program on Dutch radio, and it was for those days very exceptional that it was 1 hour only ethno music, all kinds of music, not only classical ethno but also Celtic, Irish, jigs, South American, tango, and so on. And I listened to it every week, and I was really absorbed by all these strange sounds, because now it's not strange anymore, because the world is so small now with internet and everything. But then it was very special that it was very new and really strange to me. And I still am convinced that I very influenced it in all my writing. And another thing that I think I'm influenced with is that I was raised when I was very young. All my life I lived in the polder. You know what a polder is? A polder in the Netherlands, they are known by making from sea land into land. So, and I lived there. I lived on a piece of land, and it used to be the sea. So it was about 5-6 meters under sea level. And first they made dikes, and then they drained all the thing. And then my parents moved to this new land. And I was raised with only listening to ramming the piles into the ground for years and years and years. So at home, when I went to school, sitting in the classroom, you hear this ramming the piles. And I think this influenced me also a lot about the way I use rhythm. My rhythms are sometimes very strict and like that. So rhythms and ethno music, I think that is my music, if I have to say something about that. But I think in the Netherlands, I can not speak for North America, but in the Netherlands I see actually very positive things happening, that there are coming more female students to study at the conservatories, maybe 50-50 now. And also, actually this week I heard that at the Conservatory of Amsterdam, there were 3 new appointments for 3 new composition professors, and they're all 3 women. So this is great, because now the male students learn from a woman. And this is a big change, because in history it always has been that women learn from men, and women play music by women and by men. And I noticed that male guitarists, maybe they play not so often music by women, but female guitarists, they do. They play male and female. They're a bit wiser. They play both. And what's another positive thing is that I think in Holland there is a lot of education now for small children or young people, and they get composition classes. So they can join the composition class, and then they learn to make music. And of course there are lots of girls there too. And so from very young, also the girls learn now to compose, and of course the boys. It's very interesting that everybody can now learn composition. And the only thing to improve the programmation is start with yourself. Everyone, if you want to something new, you start yourself playing music by women and teach music. That's also very important. Normally, when I look at myself, when I teach, I learn my little students, Caruli, Giuliani, and so also Carcassi. And then I noticed, hey, I don't learn them any music by women. So now I also integrate in my lessons music by Louise Walker, the simple pieces, Maria Lieneman, my own simple pieces. And so now the children also know that there are not only male composers, but there are also female composers for the guitar. So actually it's education, documentation, and programmation, which you can start with yourself.
In closing, the history of guitar orchestras has shown that the benefits for offering people the chance to play in a large guitar ensemble are numerous. I think as guitarists, we need to embrace and be proud of our instrument's heritage and how it has contributed to the advancement of our society, and that it continues to do so through both our individual and group efforts. I canvassed on social media which guitar orchestras have female music directors, and here's a listing of what I have found to date. If you would like to discover the music of more women composers, please visit the following sites. I want to thank Annette Krausbrink, Cami Rowan, Paul Sparks, Emily Shaw, John McKenzie, the Eastern Music Festival Guitar Orchestra, and the Kitchener-Waterloo Guitar Orchestra for their contributions to this presentation. I'd like to thank the Guitar Foundation of America and all of you for attending today.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the live Q&A. What a fantastic lecture by Mariette Stephenson. We're very, very grateful. I know personally I learned a lot of names and a lot of important women in classical guitar that I haven't heard before. So this is extremely, extremely valuable. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Before we go into the question and answer section, I would like to remind all our viewers that you can ask the questions either by registering for the Zoom on guitarfoundation.org, or you can follow the stream on the chat section under the lecture on Facebook. So we will do our best to answer all the questions. I guess the first question I would like to ask our wonderful lecturer today is about how you got into the how you got involved with guitar ensembles and the topic of women in classical guitar ensembles.
Thank you for the question. I first played in guitar orchestras when I was doing my undergrad and master's degree. You know, we had to do an ensemble credit, and so I chose guitar orchestra. And I really enjoyed it. My passion is playing with other people. And I love the collaboration. I love learning from other people, and whether it's with other guitarists or other instruments. So that's how I first was exposed to guitar orchestra. When it came to this particular topic, I first read about British ladies guitar bands in an article that Paul Sparks wrote for Soundboard some years ago. And I never heard of them, and I was intrigued. And I read about Mabel Downing's story in his article, and I became very intrigued, particularly because I am a Canadian guitarist. And to know that she had moved to Winnipeg and continued as a guitar teacher, I wanted to learn more. So I just started out of my own curiosity, kind of poking around, and I actually contacted some music organizations in Winnipeg, contacted city archives, contacted the provincial legislature archives, and started getting information. So I emailed Paul, and I let him know what I was finding about Mabel. And he emailed back, and he shared information about Mabel that he had not been able to publish. So he encouraged me. He was incredibly gracious and supportive. And so I continued. And so that led to like 2 years of, you know, whenever I had free time, of trying to find out information about her on Ancestry.com or, you know, online newspaper archives. I contacted the City of Bristol archives, and yeah, so it's been a journey with Mabel.
Wonderful, wonderful. And thank you for that discovery on all those details that are valuable to us. The next question I'd like to read out to all of you from the live Q&A. Actually, you just mentioned Paul Sparks. So the question from Kathy Acosta Zavala. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Stephenson. Paul Sparks' article published in Early Musics, Volume 41, Number 4, covered much of what your first part of the presentation talked about. Current research has started to focus on the personal experiences of the women player and or directors of these ensembles. Scholar Sarah Clark's work sheds light onto Augusta Harvey's personal experience by means of exploring her personal correspondence. Have you come across personal correspondence of these women from the late 19th century and early 20th century, and how they view their pioneering role as ensemble entrepreneurs and part of music-making communities?
Thank you, Kathy, for a wonderful question. Yeah, I also read Paul Sparks' article in Early Music, and I am not familiar with Sarah Clark's work with Augusta Harvey. But I am fascinated to learn more. I think it's challenging to find correspondence. Certainly, I have not found any correspondence with Mabel as yet. And I know that when I emailed Paul Sparks about this, he found it challenging as well to find correspondence because, unless the letter writer was, an important person or, aristocratic, their correspondence probably was not kept. It would have been, thrown out, not thinking that people in the future would want to read them. Same with diaries or anything like that. So, Mabel, she came from a middle-class family, but, with no children or nieces or nephews, to kind of keep any kind of mementos from her life. It's been really hard to find any kind of information like that. So I think that Paul Sparks would certainly be very interested in discovering this information about Miss Augusta Hervey and her sister, and hopefully we can maybe bring all this information together in some cohesive format just to better present this information.
Wonderful, thank you. The next question comes from Cami Rowan, who we've had the pleasure of seeing earlier in your lecture. So she thanks you for the great information, like all of us do. And she's also asking that you've told her more information that, due to time restraints could not fit in your lecture. And she's asking, will this and the other information be available in the future, or are you planning to publish any of this?
Thank you so much, Cami, and thank you again for being part of this presentation. Last year, I did a presentation on this topic for the Guitar Society of Toronto for the Toronto Guitar Weekend. And there I had about an hour and a half to talk at length about this. So I hope to be able to do another presentation in the future that will include more information. That lecture in Toronto, I was able to talk at length about Baroque composers and how they wrote for guitar, particularly Francesca Caccini and Barbara Strozzi. And there's more information that's being discovered about how women contributed at that time period. So hopefully, Cami, I'll be able to make a longer presentation and at some point be able to publish at least my findings about Mabel Downing.
Thank you so much. Question from Chuck Houlihan from the GFA. Excellent presentation in every sense. Regarding the early BMG and plucked string orchestras, I've seen many photos and printed programs over the years, but wonder if you have come across scores to the repertoire or know of any places these scores are accessible.
Thanks so much, Chuck. That's an excellent question. Off the top of my head, I know that Paul Sparks' website, he is including PDFs of music by Clara Ross. His focus and research has been with Clara. And so I believe now you can download PDFs of her published music for mandolin and guitar. With regards to BMG scores, no, I'm not sure if that is possible to access any of that. Possibly, maybe, with the archives with Vada Alcott Bickford, that might be possible. But yeah, it's very challenging because I'm sure that unless family had a lot of storage space and kind of kept things for 100 years like locked away, it's really hard to find any of the scores. I think that for the British ladies guitar bands, I suspect that a number of the scores would have been handwritten, and if they weren't playing anymore, if a member was not part of the ladies guitar band anymore, they could very well have just tossed it out. So unless people happen on a trove of their music, and same with BMG, hopefully this music will come to light, because I for one would love to be able to play the music that British ladies guitar bands played, and also what BMG orchestras would have played back 100 years ago.
Thanks so much, Mariette, for that fabulous lecture and conversation. The Q&A is going to continue in the Zoom room, so if you're interested in that subject, stay there. But for time reasons, we're going to roll on to our last lecture of this block with Jonathan Godfrey, who's going to be speaking about writing for the classical guitar.
Hi everyone, Jonathan Godfrey here. Today I'm going to be presenting a lecture called Why Is It So Difficult to Write for the Guitar? One of the biggest tragedies of the guitar repertoire is that we only have one work by Alberto Ginastera, which is his Sonata for solo guitar. And granted, that's a great piece of music, but I can't help but think that there could have been so much more we could have gotten from this composer given his affinity for the guitar. Consider the fact that he prolifically utilized a chord that literally spells out the open strings of the guitar throughout his output. And it wasn't for lack of guitarists trying to get him to write. In fact, he had guitarists from the time that he was a student asking him to write works for the guitar. When he finally did write his sonata, some 40 years into his career, the sole reason that he cited for the delay was, and I quote, "the complexity of the task delayed my creative impulse." I think that this is a really funny quote considering it's coming from the same composer that gave us works that sound like this. And yet the guitar was the thing that was too complex for him to undertake. So it begs the question, why is it so difficult to write for the guitar? And this is a phenomenon that goes back at least to the 19th century, and Hector Berlioz is one of the earliest writers to comment on how difficult it is for the non-guitarist composer to write for the instrument. And in his treatise on orchestration, he writes in the guitar entry, "It is almost impossible to write well for the guitar without being able to play the instrument. However, the majority of composers who employ it do not possess an accurate knowledge of it. They write things of excessive difficulty, weak sonority, and small effect for the instrument. Unless one can play the guitar oneself, I repeat, it is impossible to write for it pieces in several voices containing passages that require all the resources of the instrument." And it's really sad to me that even though those words were written 150 years ago, they may as well have been written today. And the difficulty of writing for the guitar is often credited to one of the reasons that we don't have any great repertoire by the likes of Beethoven or Brahms or Stravinsky or Messiaen or Aaron Copland, just to name a few arbitrary examples. So today I want to address the question, why is it so difficult to write for the guitar? So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to discuss some best practices for non-guitarist composers in dealing with the idiom, and then we're going to take a look at what actually constitutes idiomatic writing and why the very definition of what is idiomatic on the guitar is actually kind of difficult to pin down. So let's dive right in. Why is it so difficult to write for the guitar? Well, first we have to begin with this. If you're a composer who doesn't play the guitar, you're forced to write from some level of abstraction, meaning you're not beginning with the guitar, you're beginning with pen and paper, or the finale file, or some instrument that isn't the guitar at all. And then you're having to superimpose this music on top of a completely different idiom. And this isn't necessarily an uncommon way to compose. Anyone who's ever written for orchestra will likely have written for instruments they don't play. But the difference here, or when writing for a relatively forgiving idiom like the piano, is that while there are always going to be idiomatic concerns in any instrument you write for, issues of sheer playability aren't nearly as omnipresent as they seem to be with the guitar. For example, let's say that I want to write for the guitar and I want to write something very simple. I want to write a G major chord where I've got that G in the bass, and I want a third in the soprano. That seems like a fairly innocuous thing. So if I'm dealing with this in the abstract, you might say that, well, a good voicing would be an open fifth at the bottom. I don't want to repeat a third yet, and so I want another open fifth. I'll give myself a root, and then my third on the top. And so if I try to actually play that chord, though, you'll quickly realize that it's impossible. And so I've got this chord. It's sort of the closest thing that I can get, but I'm missing my G right there. And so immediately off the bat, what I thought was going to be appealing from a voicing standpoint is not even possible on the instrument. And so what voicing is possible? Well, it's actually sort of a strange chord. If I'm looking at it in the abstract, I've got two Ds here that are doubled. I've got a open voice third here at the top, and so I've got a sonority that sounds like this, which again sounds fine and isn't particularly problematic for the guitar, but from a purely abstract point of view, that's a very strange voicing indeed. And if I were to take that same principle that made that chord and transfer it to, say, a G minor chord, immediately I have something that's, again, not playable at all. This sonority isn't even remotely playable. I'm missing any possibility of using the second string. And then if I try to use good voice leading for that, it also doesn't work. The only G minor that I could play with the third on the top would be this bar chord here. And to flip the point on its head, if I use the same principles of the bar chord to make an open G major chord, that wouldn't work. And bear in mind, we haven't even gotten to actual composition yet. This is all just to create a single playable harmony. So combine this issue with the fact that the composer also has to be sensitive towards the unique sonorous nature of the guitar and its limited volume, and the fact that the guitar is usually written as a solo instrument, and things begin to become exponentially difficult. It seems like a logical solution to the problem would be that if a composer writes in the abstract, there should be an abstract way of thinking about harmony on the guitar that the composer can reference, or a few simple rules that the composer can abide by that allows the composer to follow their impulses and also allow the music to be playable on the guitar. And this seems to have been like a holy grail moment for every author who's tried to write about the guitar idiom, and I speak about this personally because this is what I set out to do in my own dissertation called Principles of Idiomatic Guitar Writing. But as I navigated how to try to conceptualize the guitar in the abstract, I quickly ran into why doing so is so problematic. For example, what's the range of the guitar? Most books will answer this question by pointing out its low note and its high note, which would be a low E to a high B or C depending on the extension. But if you want to write polyphonically for the instrument, which of course you do because it's the guitar, the range becomes considerably compressed. In my document, I suggest that in order to accommodate a range of one position, the composer conceptualize a range of 2 octaves plus a minor third. But of course, even this range is perilous for 2 obvious reasons, one of which is that this range can extend considerably higher than this, especially once you get up the neck. The other reason is that the usage of open strings complicates everything, and their use is so common that it almost makes the 2 octave plus a minor third polyphonic range seem kind of inept as a compositional tool. And even then, after considering all that, you have to deal with the range of individual notes within that 2 octave plus a minor third span, which itself becomes increasingly complex in that those intervals can either be too small or too large, or they will be unplayable. And if you throw in an open string anywhere, every principle kind of goes out the window with movable chords. And then of course, depending on what string those intervals are played, you might start to fall into problems with the right hand splaying across multiple strings in kind of an unnatural way depending on the context. Now in my document, I go to great lengths to clarify all these points and exceptions, but in my assessment, the complexity of the analysis sort of undermines its usefulness as a compositional tool for the abstract. It's almost like trying to explain to someone how to walk from an abstract point of view. So is writing in the abstract difficult to do? Yes, absolutely. But the good news is that there are a few best practices that can be followed that I think can turn this incalculably complex process into one that's actually quite manageable. And they have to deal with the areas of how the composer prepares, how they compose, and how they collaborate with actual performers on the instrument. So in the preparation phase, I want to highlight that there are a lot of documents written by guitarists for non-guitarist composers for the sole purpose of helping them to write for the guitar. And the godfather of all these documents is the 1957 article by Julian Bream, How to Write for the Classical Guitar. But I'm really amazed that really recently, like within the last decade, we've had an explosion of documents that address this point. In 2010, Chris Katchen released his Composer's Desk Reference for Guitar, which is a great, straightforward, and informative Mel Bay publication. In 2013, I completed my own dissertation, Principles of Idiomatic Guitar Writing, which can be found on a quick Google search and has some audio excerpts attached. Some even more recent offerings from that include The Techniques of Guitar Playing by Seth Yorsell and Ming Sao, released in 2014. And let me say that I'm so angry that this document wasn't available when I was writing my own document, because this thing is comprehensive, and you have the benefit of that it's written by a guitarist and a composer, and so these two different perspectives collide to create a really massive and comprehensive book that I highly recommend. Some other interesting documents include Daniel Bolshoi's 2015 document, A Study of Selected Works by Canadian Guitarist Composers from the Perspective of Idiomatic Composition for the Classical Guitar, which is a great document which has the added benefit of you're studying newer music by less known composers, and it's a really comprehensive look at the guitar idiom as well. And then one classic book that got a revision in 2015 is The Contemporary Guitar by John Schneider. Originally written in 1985, this is the go-to book for extended techniques, and the scope of the study is extraordinarily comprehensive and really delves into some far lesser known repertoire. So if you're into avant-garde composing or wanting to really dive into the world of color on guitar, this is the book for you. There is a massive document by Adrian Allen that was written just in 2018 called How to Compose for the Classical Guitar, and I highly recommend this one as well. And even as recently as this past spring, there was a dissertation completed by Jonathan Smith called Idiomatic Adaptation for the Guitar, Partnership Between Composer and Performer, which is less of a treatise on how to write for the guitar as a review on the collaboration effort between guitarists and composers. And I would highly recommend this work for guitarists and composers alike, and it's a really fascinating read that traces the evolution of how pieces of music grow from their inception and how they change as a result of the collaborative effort. Now, unfortunately, some of the worst documents on guitar composition come in orchestration textbooks. And Berlioz can sort of get a pass because his document was written in the 19th century before the classical guitar really came into its own repertoire through Segovia. But it's filled with all sorts of misinformation on the guitar. And granted, he says from the beginning that you shouldn't try to write for it unless you are a player on the instrument. But he does at least attempt to give some basic tips for writing some simple accompaniment. But even more recent orchestration textbooks are particularly not helpful. Like, for instance, the Samuel Adler orchestration book, which is my personal go-to for most orchestration questions in writing for other instruments, contains one paragraph on guitar writing, and it's got some erroneous information even there, which is a shame because, again, this is my go-to orchestration book otherwise, and I'm a huge fan of Samuel Adler's work. But in regards to guitar composition, I think your best bet is to find a document that's written by a guitarist, and as you can see, there are many options to help the composer do that. So, aside from reading these documents, another really helpful thing for the composer to do is to do some score study. Now, Jonathan Smith, in his document that I just referenced, he talks to a lot of composers and guitarists, and a common theme that he found was that in terms of score study, theme and variations are great works to look at because you have sort of a steady harmonic template which is then varied texturally, and so you get a very wide palette of what's possible on the guitar. And so these are great works to look over, whether they be Giuliani theme and variations or something more recent like the Lennox Berkeley theme and variations. The scores that Julian Bream references in his document are J.S. Bach Lute Works, Villa-Lobos Etudes and Preludes, Fernando Sor Complete Studies, the Tedesco Sonata, the De Falla Homage at the Tomb of Debussy. And this is sort of a conservative list, especially considering that it was written in 1957, but all of these are really great works to look over. Even the J.S. Bach Lute Works, even though they obviously weren't written for the guitar, show sort of the extent to which you can have very detailed polyphony. And so if you're trying to write something like a 3-voice fugue, you can see how that's possible on the instrument, and you can see sort of the ratio and distribution of notes and voices and how they sort of come together to create the composite whole. And the Villa-Lobos is essential reading, I would consider, for any non-guitarist composer, because they really show how to maximize especially the effectiveness of open strings and the ideas of arpeggios and slurs. Now there's a great blog post by Thomas O'Durkane of the Dublin Guitar Quartet called How to Write for the Classical Guitar, and he does this really cool experiment in which he commissions 2 non-guitarist composers to write for the guitar, but gives them very little instruction in how to do so. Instead, he just gives them a list of scores to study and lets them have at it. And they actually do a pretty commendable job at writing towards the idiom. And I really like the list that he offers and the principles that it encompasses, because it takes into account if the composer of the work is a guitarist or a non-guitarist. For example, he specifically points out the Benjamin Britten Nocturnal and the Gina Stara Sonata as examples of works that were mainly conceived in the abstract. And I really like the idea of recommending these kinds of works, because I think there's a lot to be gleaned in seeing how other composers overcome the limitations of not being able to physically play the instrument. Another composer he recommends, and I also of course highly recommend for score study, is Leo Brouwer, particularly because Brouwer is a rare example of a guitarist who is also quite an accomplished composer outside of the guitar idiom. And given the highly idiomatic nature of Brouwer's music, I think works like the Sonata, the Elogia della Danza, the Concerto Elegiaco, maybe even the Etudes would all be great for score study. And so now let's move on to the actual composition process. I think the most important thing for the composer when they're writing for the guitar is to not get hung up on the idiomatic problems. Absolutely, if you've reviewed documents, if you've reviewed scores, you probably have a good idea of what the guitar is capable of and the character of its sound. Those are always important to keep in mind. But if you're constantly hung up on, can I play this G major chord with the third and the soprano, I think you're going to find the composition process very frustrating. And so one technique that I recommend, going back to that polyphonic range I mentioned earlier, is to restrict writing mainly to 2 octaves plus a minor third, and then to restrict vertical notes to no more than 4, using 6 or 5 kind of sparingly. We've already seen how using that many strings can create some idiomatic problems very easily. While doing this, be aware of the possibilities of open strings and how they can expand the range, and if there's any semblance of tonality in your work, please stick to guitar-friendly keys, which will be any key that makes increased usage of open strings. So major keys would include E, A, D, G, C, and their relative minors, particularly E minor, A minor, D minor, and B minor. Those all might work really well depending on the context of the piece. So an important question after you've written a playable harmony might be, well, what do you do with it, texturally speaking? And I'm only going to briefly skim over these here. If you'd like a more in-depth review of these textures, please feel free to Google my document. But you could use, of course, any sort of vertical chord, melodic accompaniment writing, tremolo are all highly idiomatic on the instrument. And of course, arpeggiation might be the most guitaristic effect of all. And a couple of different arpeggio textures that I point out in my document are that you can have polyphonic arpeggiation, in which each note of the arpeggio belongs to a distinguishable voice, as you can see here in Carcassi Etude number 3, and the stem directions actually point out each individual voice here. You have a bass, alto, and soprano. You can also have gestural arpeggiation, in which the texture itself is more dominant than any conceivable polyphonic rendering, and here is a famous example of that in Villa-Lobos Etude number 1. And then you can have melodic arpeggiation, where there's one clear melodic line that's usually in the bass, and that's played in conjunction with a textural-driven accompaniment figuration. And if you really want to make it idiomatic, the important thing is to utilize what's called the core arpeggio, which we're going to talk about later, but basically just means that I, M, and A need to be on adjacent strings, and that ultimately might be something that you'd have to have a guitar in your hand to really figure out. Also, we've spent a lot of time talking about what's hard to write on the guitar, especially when it comes to harmony, but we haven't talked much about some of the things that are actually kind of easy to write on guitar. So one of those things is two-part counterpoint, and particularly if you stay in the range of 2 octaves plus a minor third, you'll be hard-pressed to write something that's not playable. In the case of counterpoint, it's actually not the pitch choice that often causes the problems, but rather it's the ratio of rhythms between voices. So if you're at a faster tempo, you'll want to avoid exceeding a 2-to-1 ratio of rhythmic values. For instance, if you have 16th notes in the soprano, you'd want to stick with 8 notes or slower in the bass. This passage from the double from BWV 997 exemplifies about as fast as you'd want to go in two-part counterpoint. Another obvious thing that's relatively easy to write on the guitar are monophonic lines. There's a little idiomatic issue here, save that very fast melodies can be tricky, especially if you're looking for a sort of flamenco-style plucked sound, in which case you should probably know if your player is capable of playing that before you write it. We'll talk about some other considerations with scales in regards to slurs later in this talk, and also, if you want to add a little spice to your monophonic lines, simply throw in an open string underneath it, and all of a sudden you have instant harmony. This is a very guitaristic thing to do. And so this brings us to the final step in the composition process, which I think is probably the most important for writing idiomatic guitar music, which is collaboration with a guitarist. And I'd like to begin by pointing out that whenever we listen to works by a non-guitarist composer, we really only see the tip of the iceberg, generally speaking. And it's really amazing to listen to works by like Federico Mantaroba or Joaquin Rodrigo and think, wow, they really perfectly understood the guitar idiom. Like, what was their secret? Well, their secret was they were often painstakingly behind the scenes working with guitarists to make those works more idiomatic, or the guitarists they were working with would often send in revisions that helped make those works much more playable. I was amazed when I heard Jonathan Leshnoff's guitar concerto because he's not a guitarist, and I was gratified to find out after the fact that he said that he worked painstakingly, measure by measure, with Manuel Barrueco just to make the work idiomatic at all. But the result that we hear is a wonderful work that takes advantage of abstract musical thinking combined with idiomatic guitar playing. So I want to emphasize this point by circling back to the Ginastera Sonata, because the collaboration between Ginastera and Carlos Barbosa Lima sort of shows the epic scope by which collaboration can take place. And so this work was commissioned by Barbosa Lima in 1977, who corresponded with Ginastera through the mail and asked if Ginastera would be receptive to writing a new work for the guitar. And Ginastera responded by saying he'd been traumatized by the limitations of the guitar, but was eager to work with Barbosa Lima on this work and had ideas for sort of a massive undertaking on the guitar. And so the two men began to correspond and collaborate, but because that they didn't live on the same continent and they were always constantly traveling, even working through the mail in some collaborative process was sort of an impossibility. So Ginastera basically composed the sonata by himself in isolation, and he sent the work movement by movement to Barbosa Lima. And it's worth noting that he sent the fourth movement 10 days before the world premiere. So Barbosa Lima premiered the work, and Ginastera from the outset said that the sonorous result is the most important thing in this work. And so that gave Barbosa Lima some creative leeway right off the bat to make the work perhaps a little bit more idiomatic as he saw fit. So the work was extremely well received, but Barbosa Lima had some ideas to make the work more idiomatic. So he wrote to Ginastera and said, would you be interested in collaborating with this work more? I'm happy to come to Europe. And Ginastera was very receptive to the idea, but even wanted a step before then. He wanted the work performed in Italy with some musical elite in the audience just to gauge some reaction to the work. So Barbosa Lima agreed. He went over to Italy, gave this concert. Ginastera got some feedback, and then the two basically had like a guitar summit for a number of days. and they worked extensively on the work. And it wasn't until 2 years after this that the work actually received its first publication in 1979. Then, after the work had sort of been in the public sphere for a couple of years, they released a second edition with some minor but important revisions in 1981. And then, even after this, in 1982, the two men met up yet again in New York City for the purpose of doing more revision on the sonata, which eventually led to the final publication of the work in 1984, which is worth noting was 7 years after the original commission and was a year past Gene Astaire's lifetime, as he died in 1983. He never actually got to see the final publication come to light. And so I give you this story to point out the epic nature that the collaborative process can take. When I was a student, I thought that collaboration with the composer meant meeting at Starbucks one day and looking over a manuscript and saying, well, this might work and this might not, and sort of giving some basic ideas. But the collaborative process can, and I think in many cases should, go much deeper than that. So composers, I encourage you to work with a guitarist whenever possible and be really receptive to how the guitar idiom can work better. And if you're a guitarist, be really ready to work with a composer and make it a collaborative effort. That, I think, is how guitar works ultimately become idiomatic. Again, we only see the tip of the iceberg when we see most non-guitarist composers perform. Underneath that iceberg is a lot of detailed work, sometimes painstakingly measure by measure. So now that we've talked about some best practices for the instrument, I think it's worth considering some basic idiomatic tricks for writing. And the funny thing about the guitar idiom to me is that it's really difficult to pin down what exactly constitutes idiomatic guitar writing. And what I mean is, if I were to ask a bunch of guitarists to name a few highly idiomatic guitar pieces, I don't think it's unreasonable that they might mention heavily guitaristic works like Fuoco by Roland Diaz, or Coimbaba by Carlo Domeniconi, or Sunburst by Andrew York. But what about works that don't rely on sort of guitaristic tricks like these works do? What about like Bach lute suites, or the first movement of the Concerto de Aranjuez? I would cringe at the thought of not calling these works idiomatic, but the idiom they're written towards is sort of a different idiom than the former pieces. And for me, this goes back to the idea of how pieces are conceived, whether in the abstract or whether they're generated from the guitar itself. And so I'd like to compare two original works of mine, my Sonatina for solo guitar, and then a more recent miniature called Gulfstream, because one of these works was conceived and written very heavily in the abstract, and another was really generated from the guitar and was sort of tailor-made to make use of the guitar idiom. And I'm curious if it will be obvious to you as a listener which is which. So let's take a listen. So if you guessed that Gulfstream was the one written with the guitar idiom in mind, you would be right. Now, the Sonatina wasn't composed completely in the abstract. I wrote it in 2010 after a personally very tumultuous semester of composition lessons at Indiana University, where my teacher challenged me not to touch the guitar for the entire semester because I was relying so much on the guitar to shape the way that I was composing. So I needed to get away from that and think more deliberately about the compositional language that I wanted to use. And in doing that, I really got interested in experimenting with different theoretical ideas and imitating different composers. And that's where the Sonatina was born out of. which is this more of an abstract way of thinking. I use as my basis for this work the major 7th chord, which is a sonority that I always really gravitated towards as a youngster. And each movement sort of has a different play on it. The first movement, for example, uses the major 7 chord in 4/2 inversion as sort of its theoretical base. And so throughout the work, we have passages like this that make a lot of use of it. As a guitarist, I can't say that I ever sit around practicing my major 7 4/2 inversions and voicings, but composing in this way helped me get away from just generating music that was guitaristic. The second movement of the sonatina, for instance, is very much based on some serialistic ideas that are intertwined with some guitaristic tendencies. And I will say this for any composers that are out there interested in composing serialism for the guitar, it can be a really challenging thing to do. For instance, a Schoenberg 12-tone row for piano, there will almost always be some sort of solution to any sort of issue with the tone row. You can displace things by octave, and you can keep harmonies ringing with the pedal. Whereas with the guitar, when you write serialistically, oftentimes you can't facilitate all the pitches that are being presented and still, for instance, sustain all the pitches, or you may be limited to a certain octave or register. And so composing serialistic music for the guitar can be fraught with difficulty in that regard. I would recommend putting a lot of open strings in your tone row. And then the third movement, again, was sort of conceived with some abstract ideas. In particular, there's this one section that I used, Bartók's Axis of Symmetry. See that I was also really deliberate about incorporating open strings here, and I can't say the word open strings enough when I'm talking to the non-guitarist composer. We really like open strings, and anytime that you can use them, it's really helpful, and it helps facilitate some ideas like these that are generated from a more theoretical plane. So again, the sonatina was a work that was at least conceived in the abstract, and then I was able to then go to the guitar and then make things more idiomatic after I had the basic melodic and harmonic ideas and theoretical constructs sort of in motion. And I was pretty happy with the result, and this work actually ended up winning the 2011 Boston Guitar Fest composition competition. But the one thing that I really don't like about the sonatina is that it is really hard. It is a really hard piece of music, and it's something that I really have to practice if I ever want to play it in a concert setting. And even when I do, I find that the sonatina really has more of a niche audience with new music aficionados as opposed to the general public. And so I'm at the point in my career where most of my concerts are usually done for more of a lay audience, and because of that, a couple of years ago I was really interested in writing a work that really appealed to their sort of sensibilities, and a work that wasn't so hard but also sounded really impressive. And so that's when I composed this work, Gulf Stream. But I want to show in looking at this work how the guitar idiom really generated a lot of the compositional ideas and not theoretical ideas like you found in the sonatina. So right here from the beginning, when I wrote this work, I knew that I wanted to have a lick that I could just bust out and get the rhythmic motive going. And so I chose to use this. And so this is a trick that I stole directly from Koyin Baba, and it's a slur to an open string followed by plucking a different open string. In doing that, I want to notice a couple of things. First of all the notes that I'm slurring to are open strings. And so here, open strings play a very large part in actually the harmonic construct of the piece. And so when I set out to write this work, I knew immediately that it was going to have this sort of D-Mixolydian sort of sound, because I was going to utilize so many open strings. So immediately I've already established my harmonic template without having to give much thought to it like I did in the sonatina. And this is a really common thing that you find among guitar composers that write really towards the guitar idiom. Fuoco by Roland Deans rarely ever gets outside of E minor. Coyne-Baba rarely ever gets outside its open tuning. Sunburst by Andrew York very much stays in a D major sort of sound. And then the other way that this riff helps generate the musical ideas of this piece is that it actually generates sort of the rhythmic motif of the work. And so I've got this 3 sort of pulse that's grouped in a 4-bar, which creates this almost like milonga kind of tango rhythm, which is prevalent throughout the entire work and is then used as a rhythmic device, even though this is something that I just kind of generated from a guitar riff. And there's things that I do all throughout this piece that are little quirks of the idiom that there's no way as a composer that you could know to do this unless you played the instrument. So for instance, there at bar 5, I've got this gliss, and I wasn't really intending for like a gliss to be there. It's just that it was easiest for this gliss to lead to the next position. And then here, I've got these 2 chords. Originally, I just wanted to highlight that rhythm that I had established with my opening Coyne-Baba riff there. And so originally it was going to go, but the problem with that is that it was really hard to cut off the second chord, and so I needed to find a solution that allowed me to mute that chord. And in doing that, what I found was that if I changed the bass note to that A there, that allowed me to mute my open strings and not get my right hand out of position. And so there's a couple of things I want to point out in this work that I directly stole from other guitarist composers that are really highly idiomatic. So first of all, let's talk about scales. In bar 10, I've got this sort of figure. Now what makes this part so special is that any note that's played on the same string except for the opening 2 notes of that scale is either a slur or it's played on a different string. And this is something that I very much stole from Dian's Fuoco. Consecutively plucked scales sound great, and they're very effective in a lot of contexts, but they're also very difficult to play, or at least compared to slurred notes and notes on not consecutively plucked strings. Now another idiomatic technique that I use at bar 22 is the use of what's called the core right hand arpeggio pattern. And this simply means that the right hand functions best whenever all fingers are on adjacent strings. Whenever the right hand is splayed across different strings, it starts to feel really uncomfortable, and you're probably going to get a little less accuracy from the guitarist. And so it's really advisable to keep at least I, M, and A on adjacent strings. The thumb can be free to move around. It's sort of like in 4-part harmony where the bass has a lot of leeway that the other voices don't have. And so here in Gulf Stream, I use this effect like this. So this piece is really by and large a compendium of guitar techniques, and if you are interested in looking at this work further, I want to offer that all viewers of this lecture through the week of the GFA, I am offering this piece and my sonatina for free on my website. So if you go to www.tampabayguitar.com, there on the homepage, you can download Gulfstream and the sonatina for free, and so you can check out these 2 different ways of composition, and if you're a composer, hopefully this will give you some insight on how to write for the instrument. So I hope this talk has been helpful in highlighting some of the basic best practices for guitar composition. And I want to leave you with this thought, which is that did you know that Gina Stera was actually in the process of writing a guitar concerto with Carlos Barbosa Lima right up until he died? And they had made substantial headway on this piece, but the fact that he spent a lifetime scared to write for the guitar and then was unable to finish what would have been an absolutely amazing guitar concerto is, I think, one of the biggest tragedies of our guitar literature. And so I want to shake the stigma of guitar composition, and I think we do that by making the composition process more of a collaborative effort. I think when guitarists have the right tools, the right resources, and the right people involved, I think the artistic rewards can be enormous. Thanks so much for watching.
Well, hello from the live Q&A at the 2020 Guitar Foundation of America International Convention and Competitions. We're here with Jonathan Godfrey, who gave a fantastic lecture on composing for guitar, and with all the intricacies and all the difficulties that are known to every composer. So John, thank you very much for your wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
To anybody who's watching and would like to ask a question, you can do so by going to guitarfoundation.org and registering for the Zoom platform that we're using for this Q&A. You can also ask questions on YouTube or Facebook under the stream. So with that in mind, we will go on to the first question, which comes from David Isaacs. So beautiful job in your lecture, Jonathan. Would you consider percussion techniques as idiomatic? What are your thoughts on incorporating these? Have you found new techniques you're hoping will be seen as idiomatic in the future?
Well, I really define idiomatic as more of like what's comfortable to play on the instrument. And I'm perfectly comfortable beating my guitar to a pulp, so that's no problem for me. And the funny thing about percussion and extended techniques is that they're so non-standardized. And so I often find that when I'm writing them, I usually find like I think of a score off the top of my head that's used them, and I go and see how they've notated it and how they've used them. But the John Schneider text that I recommended is really comprehensive for all that sort of stuff. And as far as like a standardization of the notation, that would be the best bet. But even looking at just like how Gina Stera like writes percussion in the sonata, or if you look at like Royal Winter Music and how Hans Werner Henze uses stuff in that, and then borrowing from that. But I absolutely do think that it should be idiomatic. I think it should be more incorporated into the idiom, and I encourage composers to beat away.
Fantastic, thank you so much. The next question comes from Werner Aguirre. How much of the difficulty of writing for the classical guitar can be considered as a difficulty in itself, and how much of it could be accounted for as the composer's lack of knowledge and training in the instrument, something composers definitely have in their formal studies concerning more traditional instruments?
That's a great question. I think the big difference between the guitar and the other instruments is that whenever you're writing for orchestral instruments, you're typically writing in an ensemble situation. And so when I go to write for French horn, even though I've got to learn things about transposition and the range and how it sounds and all these different things, I'm not worried about notes necessarily being like even playable on the instrument. And so the closest similarity to the guitar is probably the violin or the cello or any like bowed string instrument when you're dealing with double and triple and quadruple stops. But even then, you're not having to worry about an instrument being a soloist, and those polyphonic renderings on those bowed string instruments are usually much more what synthetic, I guess is the word. Like it's more like a trick. Whereas in the guitar, it really heavily relies on a firm knowledge of the idiom to produce harmonies that are effective. And every composer that I've worked with, or most of the composers that I've worked with, they don't seem like the kind of people that would be willfully ignorant about a topic, and they still have a great deal of difficulty writing for the instrument. So my feeling is that it is a particularly difficult idiom. Can composers be more educated? Yeah, of course. But by and large, I do think that there are special difficulties for the guitar that no other instrument faces.
Fantastic, wonderful. The next question comes from Chuck Houlihan. Awesome session. Thank you so much. And thanks for the free offer to play, to download and play your solo music. That's amazingly generous from you, as always. The question, in terms of the relationship of a guitarist collaborating with a composer, do you find that studying jazz and popular guitar can improve your ability to quickly demonstrate options? Not so much the jazz language, but the jazz guitarist mindset and the approach to the harmony in the fretboard?
That's a great question. It's a great idea. So, Chuck, I think if I'm understanding the question right, so is this like more of if it's more of like a shared language sort of thing, like for instance, if a composer knows how to play some basic like, open chords or jazz shapes, like can they then incorporate it into the idiom? And I think absolutely. In fact, that's actually sort of how Berlioz recommends to compose in his treatise on orchestration, because when he talks about harmony, he actually gives basically the caged system, and he says these are the open chords that you can use. Basically mess around with these and don't go to anything else. And then he talks about the bar and stuff like that. But yeah, I think there is a really strong common vocabulary with jazz and pop that could more readily be exercised in the classical repertoire. Having said that, I've also worked with, I do a lot of work with Broadway shows. And I find that when there's orchestrations of new works, oftentimes, even then, the composers aren't really quite clear oftentimes on what works idiomatically for the instrument. So I actually don't think it's just a classical guitar issue. I think it's also just the guitar in general can be a really difficult thing to approach.
Wonderful. So would you say Berlioz did us a favor, or did he shoot us in the foot?
Well, I mean, the 19th century was such a different time for the guitar. I think it wasn't time at that point for the guitar to really have a non-guitarist composer repertoire, in large part because the idiom is so generative, again, of the composition process that like Villa-Lobos, for instance. Could you imagine a Villa-Lobos etude with the etude 1 with this descending what is it, diminished seventh chord with open strings going down? I mean, that's a really sort of strange harmony, and the only way that could be really accepted is in the 20th century vocabulary. So did Berlioz do us a disservice? Maybe, but I don't think he was entirely wrong, because if you think about 19th century composers, they were the ones that understood the idiom and could write in that sort of common tonal language. And why write for the guitar and sound like Soar when Soar can already do it so much better than you can?
That's an excellent point. Yeah. Okay, another question from Werner Aguirre. How much of the difficulty of writing for the classical guitar can be considered as a difficulty? Oh no, we have answered that question.
Yeah.
I apologize. That's the same person asking, so I just jumped in. If the idiomatic fitting is a must, composers don't take the risk of being repetitive. So if idiomatic fitting is a must, do composers take a risk of being too repetitive by using, let's say, a chord, or for example, like you outlined Villa-Lobos descending chord?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's always going to be the risk in any instrument that you're going to be repeating something. And obviously we're not trying to just mimic the same things over and over. I think the idea is if I'm a composer and I've got something in the abstract that I've written and I want to put it on the instrument, I'm not trying to sound like Roland Deans. I'm not trying to sound like a a guitarist composer. I'm just trying to get my things playable on the instrument. And so what I'm advocating for isn't necessarily like, let's all like do the same arpeggio patterns and utilize those. It's, well, if that technique facilitates what you're trying to do creatively, then you're going to have a more successful composition. And so that would be probably my thought on that.
Wonderful. One more question from the same person. How can the composer balance the need of fitting their composition to idiomatic aspects of the instrument versus the demands of art and musical language itself?
That's a great question. And I think that's actually one of the biggest difficulties in guitar composition. Other instrumental idioms, like when you compose for a large ensemble or when you compose for like the piano, there's so few restrictions on what you can do that you're really just sort of limited to your imagination and then the very free restrictions of the instrument. Whereas the guitar is sort of limiting in that regard. And so I think we're coming to a point in the repertoire where the need to be creative continues to grow, especially scordatura is a relatively unexplored concept. I mean, we have really great scordatura works, but if you think about it, you pretty much have an unlimited configuration of pitches that you can create. And if you are being really creative in that respect, making music that's idiomatic and also very artistically satisfying, I think becomes a lot more achievable. Now, there's a lot of issues with writing for scordatura, especially with notation, and it's already hard enough to read guitar sheet music, and making the tunings different doesn't help a lot. But I think that that's an area that's really ripe for some creative discovery for sure.
Fantastic, thank you so much. A question from one of our viewers. Some universities offer the guitar fret harmony course, the fretboard harmony. Would you say that's a class worth taking?
Oh, 100%, and not just for composers, but for guitarists. I think it's so essential to understand that I think sometimes we get too involved as classical guitarists, getting involved with the concept of just like memorizing music without really understanding what is fundamentally happening in the music and connecting scales and modes and different harmonies. So I think as a performer, yes, that is like an unbelievably important concept to really get across. As a composer, I would be really interested to see like if a composer would do well in a fretboard harmony class. I guess it would depend on the institution and sort of the level that they're teaching to. But yeah, I think that that's a wonderful thing to do regardless.
Oh.
Hi there. Thank you guys for sticking with us throughout the day here. Hope you've been enjoying all the content. For those who don't know me, my name is Brian Aguirre. I'm the convention manager for the Guitar Foundation of America. And I'm here to tell you about the rest of today and tomorrow, and to reveal our mystery performer. So coming up today, after this stream, we're going to take a brief intermission, very short, to just get set up for the International Concert Artist Competition preliminary round. So this will be the second day of those, so stay tuned. Tomorrow morning, we're going to open up with a technique workshop by Michael Partington, who gave a beautiful concert this afternoon. Following that, throughout the day, tomorrow is one of our first ever track days, and we're going to do a track day about research with the guitar. So there's going to be some lectures throughout that are just going to be devoted to research and guitar scholarship. It would not be a GFA convention without some performances. So we have a performance by the Canadian Guitar Quartet, by Goran Krivokapic and Pablo Garibay. So stay tuned for those. Now, to reveal today's final performance, our encore performance that we have at the end of every stream, of Lagrima by Francesco Tarrega. And I'm very excited to announce today's performer. Are you ready? I'm ready. Benjamin Verdery. Enjoy.